And all of a sudden I hear this shout, this loud shout that says the Messiah is coming. My first thought is that that Messiah is Al-Mahdi, Islamic Messiah that is going to come here on earth as Islam promises, and that will chop off the heads of those that have not been obedient to Allah. I saw him standing there, and I couldn't see his face from the amount of light and of glory that was actually emanating out of his face and out of his countenance. And I fell face first on the ground, worshiping him, and the peace and the joy that I felt, it was something that was outside of this world. It's as though like burdens and weight and hardship and turmoil were just lifted off. My mother, who was kind of a rejected child, she was the only baby girl. Her brothers verbally and physically abused her. Even my grandfather, back in the days in Lebanon, that's where my mother was born, he would abuse her. And so my mother grew up with that sort of rejection spirit, with that abandonment spirit. So eventually what happened is when she turned 18, she met my father. She didn't know much about my father. But, she wanted to leave with the first man that actually came because she wanted to leave her parents' house, which she ended up doing. So they moved into the capital city of Beirut in Lebanon. And so, believe it or not, my father began to verbally and physically abuse her. So he beat her up almost every day, and he stole her jewelry. He stole, her material possessions, everything that she had ever collected, right? He would take that and spend it on alcohol and drugs. So he was someone that was kind of broken, and he was also battling his demons. So long story short is that my mother had to live through a lot of pain and agony. And so she, gets pregnant with me and my other sister. And so comes a point where my father decides to just leave. So he basically runs off. He goes somewhere else. He flies out. He goes to Toronto, and he leaves her on her own in Lebanon. And if you know anything about the 80s and how unstable Lebanon was, it was very politically unstable. And you had these sectorist wars that happened all across Lebanon. So it was a time of war. It was a time of a lot of atrocities. It was staggering, to say for the least. The amount of pain that Lebanon underwent. And so comes a point where my father decides to give my mother a shout, and he goes, "Listen, I've changed. I'm here in Toronto. I've settled in. I've got a business. How about you? Just pack up everything. I'll pay for your ticket and come and see me." And so that's when my mom, decides to basically leave everything behind, and she decides to, grab her children, and she decides to fly out for Toronto. And so, unfortunately, what ends up happening is that what my mother was promised from my father, these expectations were never fulfilled. My father actually turned to be even worse when we landed in Toronto. And so she thought that my father had changed because he was asking for forgiveness. But it turned out he was just gaslighting my mom, so she would come and work in his restaurant, right, and basically run his business for him while he had his side girls, and he did all that stuff, right. And believe it or not, I mean, we saw everything with our bare eyes. We witnessed the abuse. Once again, we witnessed the violence, the way my father assaulted my mother. We decided to basically run off with my mother's cousin, who was in Montreal. So he comes and picks us up while my father's actually at work, because it was the day my father tried to kill my mother. And I'm not even kidding. It was literally like he tried to kill her. He basically pulled a knife on her, and he grabbed her by her hair, and he wanted to throw her off of the window. And he had a knife on her neck, and thank God, I don't know how it happened, but by the grace of God, the Lord spared her life. And so afterwards, we come to Toronto, and so my mom is looking for a job, and of course she's trying to make ends meet, and she's working the double or triple shifts just so she can raise us up in a decent way, just so she can provide for herself and her children. And so she meets this man who becomes a friend with her, who tells her that he's from Lebanon as well, from the same village. And so very quickly, that man kind of gains my mother's trust. And so my mother begins to trust that man, thinking that he is a man that will help us, sort of get us out of the hole, and really set us, on a rock, right? And really provide for us and sustain for us and all that stuff. Now, I don't want to take anything away from that man. That man helped us tremendously, but he was also a radical Muslim, and his views were very disturbing. They were very radical. So you can only imagine the type of behavior, that he would, take out on us back home. And so he was like the father figure in some way, a father that we never asked for, but he decided to be our father. So he walked in, he settled in overnight. And so he began to, abuse us again, be harsh with us. And he kind of pushed also Islam on us very radically. We were people that were kind of nominal at the beginning, if I can put it like that. My mom wasn't really much of a religious person herself. She prayed, but I mean, that's all she did. Like a lot of the modern Muslims, less radical. But that man seemed to want to push Islam really hard on us, and he did. And so, because he beat us up, because he mistreated us, because we lived under his bad attitude at home, I figured, well, might as well, friend him, become his friend. So, I kind of get him off of my back for a little bit, or off of my sister's back. So I decided to kind of, make him happy. And I decided to study Islam and show him that I was genuinely interested in Islam. So by the age of 15 or 16, I began to intensely read about Islam. And every time my mother would give me money, for example, I'd go and buy myself philosophical books on Islam, or tafsir books, which are, commentaries of the Quran, and so on and so forth. So I was trying to dive in deeper into that religion to find out about my identity, who I was, what was that religion about, right? And so very quickly, as the years kept passing, I found myself, diving in deeper and deeper and deeper, and I was trying to make a sense of that religion. But in reality, I was, I was finding more. I was finding a lot of mistakes in that religion. And how did I know these were mistakes? I was part of a community center, an Islamic community center, where I went to pray on Friday and other days throughout the week. And so every time I got a chance to ask the imam of the mosque questions, that kind of didn't sit well with me, he wouldn't be able to answer. And so I was left wondering what is going on. Why is Islam not clear? Why does it look like there are a lot of contradictions in the Quran? And so comes a point where, I ask questions to that man, and that man, of course, gets offended because he's probably thinking, like I'm thinking about walking away. So he gets offended, and he becomes more harsh. He becomes more violent. So I go through a depression. I go through a crisis, and if you know anything about a crisis, you have to ride the wave. You kind of have to wait until that crisis just ends, or fades away. And so I went through a crisis that lasted many years, a crisis of identity. I was seeking for peace. I was seeking for something. I was seeking for answers. I was seeking for truth, and never could I ever tap into that truth or into that peace the way I wanted to with Islam, because I didn't have my answers. I didn't feel peace when I prayed. And every time I went up to him, I went up to my mother and I said, listen, I'm not feeling peace, in that religion. And I sort of want that peace. My mother would reply, well, pray more and Allah will give you peace. Or read the Quran more and you'll end up finding, that peace, right? Now, what I knew about Islam very early on is that there's no such thing as a son-father relationship according to the Quran. For, the Quran says very explicitly that Allah is not a father to anybody. So I couldn't have actually had a relationship with Allah the way I wanted, especially that I had lost my father and I was going through a lot of traumas and I was broken from the inside. So much that, I almost wanted to kill myself. My mom would sometimes find me standing on the balcony from the ninth floor. I wanted to jump off. That was like in the middle of the night. And so I became suicidal. I was broken. from the inside. My mom even thought that I had demons, so she had to summon, some imams to come over and kind of pray for me to release me from these demons. So that's how intense this was. Every time I went to sleep, I would see nightmares and visions of hell. I was scared. Sometimes I would not leave my house for days on end because I felt as though, like, if I left my house, I'd probably die and go to hell, because I feared that God that is called Allah. Because when you read the Quran, in reality, what you see is that there's threats everywhere. If you don't do enough, if you don't follow the religion enough, if you don't walk in the ways of Allah, consequently, and you will end up, going to hell. And so I was scared of that God, and yet, I stayed there because I didn't want to be thrown into hellfire. But long story short, fast forwarding a couple of years later, I get a job. It was during the month of October. It was throughout that season that is called Ramadan. I was maybe 19, 20 years old, if I remember correctly. I get a job from a imam of a mosque, a local imam of a local mosque that we knew, who had a restaurant, a Middle Eastern restaurant of, the shawarma stuff. So I show up one day. It was cold. It was a little bit chilly outside. So I show up for my first shift on my first day to that restaurant, and I'm standing there behind the counter. And as I'm actually standing there, making food, servicing the clients, um, there's a guy that comes in, and that guy that comes in, he is very tall. He's got a scary demeanor to himself. He's got a long beard, and just by looking at him, you could tell that he was a Salafist Muslim, one of those radical Muslims. And so I remember my boss was also with me in the restaurant. And I remember my boss coming up to me to say, listen, don't talk to him. Whatever you do, just stay away from him. Don't get into any religion debates, because this guy is, not all there. And he's kind of violent, right? So you don't want to get into a hurdle with him because he's scary. And my boss basically hired that man to do the dishes before they, close the restaurant at night, all right, for a couple of hours. Now, just a few hours later, I'm still working there, and there's almost no one sitting in the restaurant except for two clients, two ladies there. There's another man that comes in. That man is younger than the other man. So that man comes in and he goes, listen, can I talk to my brother, the guy that works in the kitchen? I said, of course. So he walks in and he goes to the kitchen, and the two brothers have a conversation together. And I'm looking at the scene from far. I can barely see them, but I can hear them almost screaming. So in my mind, I thought that this was just part of their dialect, the Moroccan dialect, which is slightly more aggressive than the typical Middle Eastern dialect. If you know anything about dialects, Lebanese is not the same as Moroccan or Algerian. The African dialect is slightly more rough on edges than, the Lebanese or Syrian or Palestinian, for example. But anyways, long story short, I look back over my shoulder and I see the younger brother coming out from the kitchen, walking backwards and holding onto a chair, and he's basically trying to protect his life. So I figured to myself, what is going on here? I wonder what was going on. I didn't quite understand what had happened, but it seemed like they got into this fight for whatever reason, they got into a fight for. So the younger brother was coming backwards, trying to walk his way out of, the store while trying to protect himself. And his brother simply wouldn't let him go. And he had a knife in his hand. And so what happened next is really brutal. So he basically grabbed his brother and he slit his, throat open. Yeah, that was crazy. And so we all stood there watching the entire scene. The younger brother, the victim, put his hand on his neck. And a couple of seconds later, I found him standing right in front of me, looking at me, face to face. And when I looked at him, I felt like he was actually begging for his life, pleading for his life, as though, I could do something. But, my hands were tied up. I didn't know what to do. I was standing from the other side. I was standing on the other side of the kitchen counter. So I couldn't really, do anything. But when he took his hand off of his throat or his neck, right, the blood began to gush and ooze, and his blood just sprinkled me everywhere, right? And so he went outside and he ended up actually passing, a couple of minutes later. So I went outside, I grabbed him, and the guy was agonizing to death and he lost all his blood in the street there while people watched. And we went in, and then we waited for the cops. They arrested the guy, and then, the rest is basically history. So to make this a long story short, fast forwarding a couple of days later, I'm depressed. I'm feeling, completely depressed. I'm broken, hopeless. This is not leaving my mind, right? This is this image of this man getting killed is rushing into my mind every day. And so, one night I go to sleep, and as I go to sleep, depressed, feeling restless about my life, broken, with the sort of stuff that I had been going through. I see a vision. And when I see that vision, it wasn't like a dream. It was really a vision. It was a vivid vision. It was something that you could almost touch, that was tangible, right? Because a dream, you catch information, piece of information here and there, and sometimes you forget about the rest of what happened, right? But in this vision, it's almost like I could remember everything, and it was just so real, right? And I could live it, I could experience it, and the emotions were there, the feelings were there, right? And so in my vision, I had this out of body experience where my soul left my body, and my body is basically laid upon a bed. And as my soul leaves my soul is hovering in midair, close to the ceiling in that room that I imagine was, a temple, like an old temple. I was kind of in a basement somewhere. It was pitch dark, lighting here and there, but it was kind of dimmed down, right? I could barely see around me. But I remember looking, from, my soul, and I was seeing myself also, scared in bed. So it's almost like I'm looking through a mirror, right? And I could feel exactly what was happening to me in that bed. In that bed, I was restless, I was hopeless. I knew that I died, and I knew that there was no hope for me. And so fear, grabbed me, and it's almost like I knew that I was spiraling down, hell. And how did I know I was dead? Well, I was looking around, and I was actually pleading for, some ladies that were there around the bed, making the bed, for them to help me. And they couldn't see me. They couldn't hear me. So I figured, okay, these ladies don't even see me. They don't hear me. So I must be dead. And I remember my legs were paralyzed in the bed, and I couldn't move my legs. And all of a sudden I hear this shout, this loud shout that, could paralyze anyone if you hear that, shout, almost like a shout of an angel that says the Messiah is coming. And so when I heard the Messiah is coming, my first thought is that Messiah is Al-Mahdi. He is that Islamic Messiah that is going to come here on earth as Islam promises, and that will establish his reign and rule on earth, and that will chop off the heads of those that have not been obedient to Allah. And I figured I was, part of that group because, I had inner secrets and desires that were hidden from people around me. And I knew that that man could know about everything that was going on, about my sins, my temptations, my hatred, towards people, my unforgiveness. And so I proceeded to cover myself with the covers, with the sheets. So, whenever that man walks in, he wouldn't see me, as if I could hide, from him. But I was paralyzed, so mind you, I couldn't move my legs. But instantly, what happens is that instead, I hear poof, 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 like loud steps in the hall, not too far away. And I heard this, imposing being walk towards the room I was in. And the closer the person walked into that room, and the more the light just shone out of that person into the room I was. And then, it went from darkness to, lighter and lighter and lighter, to becoming the most beautiful light I'd ever seen. A light I can't even describe to you, something that is outside of this world. And so I heard a voice. That man that was standing by the doorpost said, "Uncover yourself." And so I ended up actually uncovering myself. And ironically, so I looked up and I saw him standing there, and I couldn't see his face from the amount of light and of glory that was actually emanating out of his face and out of his countenance. I could just see his mouth and his smile and his beard, and it was the most beautiful thing ever. I remember, telling myself, wow, this is the most majestic thing I've ever seen, right? Or even come close to seeing. And so I knew that I was in the presence of someone else than just a mere human being. That man had to be, some sort of God or God. And mind you, I didn't know anything about Christianity at that point. I thought that Christianity was a blasphemy. I thought that Judaism was blasphemous towards Allah. How can Allah have a son? God forbid, right? That's what they teach us. That's the type of brainwashing and grooming that, the imams do in the mosques and everywhere, where they really groom that stuff into the minds of the followers of Islam. And so right away, that man comes in and he sits at the edge of the bed, and he he places his hands on my knees, and he begins to pray, and then he says, "Son, stand up and walk." That's the first thing that I remember him saying. So when he said that, I got the shivers all over my body, but I knew I couldn't walk. So in despair, in sorrow, I answered and I said, "I can't walk, right? I just can't walk. My legs are paralyzed." And then he reiterated again, the same words. He said, "You made that statement, son, get up and walk." And then I proceeded to cry again, and then I cried some more, and I said, "I can't walk." And then he stood up. He ended up actually going somewhere in the corner of that room, where there was a table, and on that table there was set a book. And he basically took that book, that big book, that white book that was like white like snow. The pages were empty. There was absolutely nothing written down in that book, but it was a beautiful book, a big one. And when he walked, looking at him actually passed me by before he actually sat on the edge of the bed, it could have only been God, because I knew, from his presence, and also like knowing that the mountains around where we were, surrounding us, were actually moving and shaking at the strength that that man had. So I knew that that man could only be, a divine being. And so once again, he sat there on the edge of the bed, and he opened up that book. He placed it on my knees, and this time he's reading right through the book. And as he's reading, or he's praying in this language that I did not recognize back then, it must have been Hebrew or Aramaic, right? The words are actually getting created. So he's actually speaking life into these words, and these words are just, they're coming out of the book, and they're just floating everywhere, and they're becoming fire. So I knew that that man had, such authority and power and dominion over these words that he was himself, like, declaring. And so that's when he said once again, "Son, stand up and walk." And this time I was able to actually stand up and walk. And so I stood up, I walked a little bit, and I fell face first on the ground, worshiping him. And the peace and the joy that I felt, it was something that was outside of this world. It's as though like mountains and of burdens and weight and hardship and turmoil were just lifted off that moment, right there and then, right? And I felt like light like a feather. It was something that I'd never felt before, and I was always seeking for something like that. And so for the first time I was experiencing that, I was tapping into that, right? And so he put his hand on my head and he said, "Son, if you're looking for that peace, right, you'll find it in me." But again, he left me with a clue. He left me with a hint, but he didn't give me his name. He didn't tell me who he was. But I knew he wasn't, the Mahdi from the Islam, because his characteristics, were not matching. And so that's when I found myself waking up from that dream, you know, falling in love with that being, but not knowing who he is. But I knew that he was divine at the same time. And so what I ended up doing is that I ended up going around asking questions to Christians and Jews. And, the Jews would, when I would go to their synagogues, because of the tension between Palestine and Israel back then, right? Because it's always been tense, but there was a season when that happened in my life, right? The tension was actually higher, just like recently, for example. And I was 19 or 20 back then. So, you can visualize the entire scene. I walk into a synagogue, and then they know I'm Arab, so they call the cops, and then I'm just running out from every synagogue. I'm just running off, right, escaping from my life before the cops actually show up. And I got so desperate, looking for answers, and I couldn't find them. I thought that God wanted me to be a Jew at first, because after that first dream, I had 11 dreams afterwards, where it was all about Judgment Day, and had a Jewish connotation to it. I was seeing myself like an old rabbi. I was given a Torah, I was given a Bible. And mind you, once again, I didn't know much about either Christianity or Judaism, because I was swimming in Islam all my life, right? That was just culturally imprinted in me. So I didn't know much about these religions anyway. So I couldn't have actually made that up. You don't make that stuff up, right? So I thought God wanted me to become Jewish, but I got so discouraged, because every time I'd go see a rabbi, he would discourage me, and he would say, listen, it's not this easy, right? You have to be 21 at least. Your mom has to agree. She has to consent, for you to travel to Israel and then become a Jew. But anyways, fast forwarding 10 years later, because along with the years, I actually lost track of that. I lost interest. I was like, forget it. Everybody discouraged me. That was probably just, an illusion. So I doubted what I had received. And the devil was good at making me doubt. And so it's like he stole that seed that God had actually planted. And plus, my mother and my friends were always threatening me of disowning me if I, reverted to any other kind of religion. So I decided to kind of just leave everything aside and just to go through life. And my life got worse and worse and worse, so much that I became depressed for almost 10 or 11 years. I went into the world. I did a lot of drugs, every drug out there. I hung up with the wrong type of people. My identity crisis was getting worse, because I was seeking for, I was searching for a reason to live, and I couldn't find one, right? I was very suicidal, but yet again, I would never take my life away, because point being, I didn't want to die and go to hell, because Allah was still in the back of my mind. And now I'm about 25 years old, I believe, or 26, and I meet up this I meet this girl who we get into a relationship with, and we both had our demons. We were both battling our own demons. It was an extremely toxic relationship, and that girl was of Catholic background, not religious herself, right? She couldn't care less about God. Her parents were like calling themselves Catholics for only on Christmas and other days, but they couldn't care less, right? Long story short, the relationship was very toxic. It was not getting anywhere. I was going through a lot, with this girl, and she was going through a lot, and I suffered a lot. She suffered immensely, and so fast forwarding a couple of years later, we decide to break off the relationship. But before we break off the relationship, she basically tells me that she feels bad for some of the stuff she did to me. And some of the stuff she did to herself, and she feels bad for her past, and she wants to make peace with herself and with her past. So she goes, I had this Pentecostal friend, right, who invited me into her church. She's a Latina. She goes to this mega church, right? And apparently she told me that if I got baptized, if I got water baptized, I'd be saved and all my sins would be forgiven. So now, when she comes up to me and says that, as a Muslim back then, I was like, this doesn't make sense at all. This is just so stupid. As if I had figured out, what was actually, good for me. But anyways, like I was like, forget about this. If you're going to become a Christian, then there's no point, for us to stay together. I don't want my children in the future to become, Christians. Like, God forbid, right? That's not for me. She goes, listen, this is really important for us, for me. And I think this is important for us. Would you please come and at least be there for my baptism? Which I said, no, I'm not going to show up. I don't want to be there. So she got her mom to finally call me and persuade me to go to church, which I did. It was on a Sunday morning. And being the arrogant person that I was, I show up to church and everybody's just welcoming. They're so loving, they're so caring. They're coming up to me, they're shaking hands. I'm like, I love you, we love you. And I'm like, how can you say you love me? You don't even know me. You're such hypocrites. And so that was the kind of reaction that they got, off of me. I was very arrogant, very prideful. I was very hurt. And I was violent also at that time. So, I would just say it the way it was, straightforward. I would not hide my emotions or my feelings. So I ended up sitting there, and I was going to create a fuss in the church because I wanted to stand up at some point and say Jesus is not the Son of God in front of the entire church. You had almost 500 members sitting there that day. And so she grabbed me by the arm and she said, please don't make a scene. Just let me get, my baptism, quietly, and then we'll leave. We'll go home. So she ends up getting baptized. And I'm like, forget about this. I don't want to talk to her anymore. And so, believe it or not, just a couple of days later, I'm actually driving, and I don't know what just takes over me. It's something that overtakes my mind and my heart, and I begin to cry. I begin to cry, with a lot of sorrow, a lot of pain. And these tears are tears of sorrow and pain, but joy at the same time. And I can't really explain it. It's just supernatural. I'm sitting there in the car and I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening, but something hit me. And when that thing hit me, I saw a cross, a red cross. And I was so out of control. I couldn't keep myself, straight for a moment. I couldn't drive that I had to actually pull over. So I ended up pulling over on the side of the road. And then I just sat there in my car and I cried and I cried and I cried for maybe an hour. And I felt as though I was getting emptied out from my past life and, filled up again by this love, this unconditional love that I couldn't explain. And for the first time, I was feeling remorse and regret for the things that I did. And I knew that I had messed up big time with a lot of people in my own life. I was with my mother, with people that I hated, people that I was confrontational towards. I knew that I was guilty, but how? I don't know why, how it hit me. I've got no clue. All I know is that, it felt really, it felt really good. And so just a couple of days later, she tells me, she comes up to me, my ex, and she goes like, listen, there's this youth gathering on, Friday, which is like tomorrow, right? I know it's last minute, but I really want you to be there. You don't have anything to lose, right? But everything to gain. I mean, at this point, you're broken, this and that. Like, how do you know that Jesus is not going to fix it for you? And I'm like, who's that Jesus, man? You guys say Jesus is the Son of God. You guys are crazy. You're out of your mind. So anyways, I was like, listen, I have nothing better to do right now, so I'm just going to go there. And I ended up going there. And I knew that the Holy Spirit was actually leading me there, right? Because the Spirit says that it convicts not just Christians, but the world of righteousness, justice, and judgment. And I knew that God was convicting me to go there, which I ended up doing. And while I sat there, the pastor that was preaching from the pulpit, as he preached to that youth group, to these people there, these youngsters that were there that night, he preached on Matthew 11:28, which became very quickly my favorite passage, which says, "Come to me, all of you are laden and heavy burden, and I will give you rest. Learn from my peace, for I am lowly and meek. Take upon yourself my yoke, for it's easy, and my burden, which is light." And so when he spoke these words, it just touched me. It hit me so hard. And I just began to cry, to cry, to cry. And I couldn't stop myself from crying. I couldn't care less about the judgment and who would say what, right? I was just crying on top of my lungs. I was screaming. I was crying out to Jesus for whatever reason I did that, right? I was just crying out. I was like, I'm hopeless to that extent. I'm just going to, try Jesus. Who knows, right? And it's almost like this force that took me and pulled me down on my knees and got me to leave my aisle and go in the middle alley and pull me down on my knees, and I couldn't care less about who said what, and I began to scream. I began to shout, Jesus, Jesus, help me, I need you, I need you. And something overtook me from the inside, and the peace and the love and that peace that surpasses all understanding, like the Bible says, right, that overtakes you. It just overtook me right there and then. And I knew that I was a changed man, that something had happened, right? I had an encounter with the Lord Jesus Christ. And when people saw that, when the pastors saw that, they came out of their way and they began to impose their hands on me, to lay their hands on me and pray for me. And then I left, and from that point on, every day I'd go to sleep and I'd see a different vision, a different dream of Jesus. I saw myself in heaven. I saw his white garment. I saw the light. I saw the glory. I was getting changed, transformed. I was falling in love with Jesus day after day. And that was, almost 11 years ago. And ever since, well, it has been a beautiful journey, and it was definitely the best decision that I made. Um, I knew that I was saved by grace through faith alone, not my own works, because I call on the name of the Lord. And the Lord proceeded to change me through His Spirit. And I am here today as a changed man, as a man who delivers the gospel message everywhere I go, um, as a pastor, as a brother, as a servant, as a husband, as a brother, and I can't thank Jesus enough for that. And so that's pretty much, like the crux of my testimony.